Welcome to the LPL pre-show, where we're going to talk about the recent Grand Prix that happened this weekend in GP Richmond. I'm joined with Wilson Hunter, Bob Huang, and Cyrus Corman-Gill. Guys, how do you feel about this past weekend? I know all three of you competed. How did it go for you guys?
I felt like I did the best out of everyone in this skip call here. Which is really what matters in the grand scheme of things.
I guess so. Bob, you played Storm this weekend, right?
I did play Storm this weekend.
Interesting. And Bob, what did you play?
I played Four-Color Loam.
Okay, and Wilson?
I played mediocre Grixis mid-range / control.
Gotcha. So, I mean, this was a pretty exciting weekend following, well, let's see, this is the biggest event since the Pro Tour, right? And looking at the sort of decks we have, I guess let's start by talking about the winner, the top 8 lists, and then delve a little bit deeper. So Andrew Cuneo in first place with Blue-White Miracles. Interesting deck choice. I feel like he just sleeved up his Pro Tour 75 and then just brought it here and crushed everyone. How do we feel about Miracles, it winning the GP, and I guess then we'll move into the top 8.
Well, let's start with you, Anuraag. What do you think about Miracles? Do you like the deck? And if so, why?
I think the deck is pretty powerful. It's got some unique choices and a lot of selection. I'm glad that it won. It's my personal favorite deck. It's what I've played for the last 4 years almost.
Well, interesting.
Yeah, and I think it's got a lot of good matchups, and it's just very consistent.
Cool. Yeah, to me, it seems like a kind of deck that is finally starting to become okay positioned. I don't know. I chose my words carefully there. So I think Miracles might not actually be bad now. And the reason for that is when we start to go through all these other decks, we see a lot of other fair blue strategies. I consistently saw Miracles doing pretty well against the current Grixis mid-range / control decks. I think that they're called Grixis control, but they really play out very mid-rangey. And definitely impressed by how Miracles attacks that matchup, particularly you, Anuraag. I watched you play against, I think, a couple Grixis control opponents, one of which was a world champion, and you did very well in that match, I believe. So, yeah, so in my opinion, I think that's maybe a reason why we're seeing some Miracles decks doing well. I personally played Miracles in the Legacy PTQ, and after scrubbing out of the GP, was fortunate to top 8 that with 4 copies of Accumulated Knowledge in my deck, and had a blast playing that. So I felt like it was pretty powerful, and I think I'll be practicing with that deck moving forward quite a bit. But let's see, was there a Baneslayer Angel in the sideboard of the GP winning list?
I'm pretty sure there was. Yeah, it was quite interesting choice. No other win conditions in the deck, like just Snapcasters and Jace and Baneslayer Angel. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought that was a super interesting choice because in Legacy, the creature decks don't really give you time to set up. Like Eldrazi and Delver are just so fast. Whereas like something like, I don't know, like Elspeth Sun's Champion almost makes more sense to me because the control decks, the games tend to go really long and you do have time to set up. But I don't know, like I'm really curious as to how that went for him, if he ever used it and if it was good.
Well, let's see. You really do think Delver is fast? Like I think Delver traditionally has been pretty quick, but what it seems to me is that the current iterations of Grixis Delver seem a little bit slower in favor for some more resilient threats.
He had a Gideon.
Oh, he did it? Okay. Yeah, there was. Okay.
A Gideon and a Click in the sideboard, and then not really win condition, but 2 Containment Priests also.
Nice.
Okay. Those are things that, tap sideways and kill. So I guess looking at the rest of the top 8, we see lands. We see Noah Walker playing Shadow, but it's really Noah Walker who top 8'd. Another copy of Miracles, Rug Delver, Blue-White Legend Blade, and Eldrazi and Grixis Control. That Legend Blade deck looks kind of interesting. I don't think I've seen something like that before. It looks like it was piloted by none other than Joe Lissette. How do we? This is an interesting challenger to the forefront. Do we think this is going to make a heavy impact in the Legacy format, or just like as another?
God, no.
I don't think anybody was able to win with like his build of Miracles. And so, like, would we expect anybody to be able to win with his build of Stoneblade?
Joe Lissette and Venser Shaper Savant have some sort of strange connection that no other person in Magic card have. And anytime that card is in his deck, I feel confident he can top 8 a GP with things like 3 Ponders, 3 Force of Will, 2 Spell Snare as a split in his deck, along with 3 Stoneforge Mystic so that you can fit in 2 Vencers. But I feel it ended up working out, and he's a really, really good Magic player. So
I'm going to give some pushback. Yeah, let me give some pushback on this, because I think that it is an illogical argument. I hear this all the time. Nothing against Bob and Cyrus here, but I hear the argument that, you know, such and such player is the only player that can do well with X terrible deck. And in my opinion, like there's a piece of that might be true, in that a player's skill can overcome maybe some sort of strange deck choices, but there has to be something about the deck that matched up well against the opposing decks in the tournament. And I think particularly if you start to see the grindiness of this metagame, I think that's where a lot of these Legends type cards actually shine. So, you know, there was an era where Legends Miracles did okay in the hands of other people. Like, no one other than Joe Lissette did consistently well with it, but it was always the best Miracles deck against Sneak and Show, and it was also pretty good in Miracles mirror matches. So maybe we're getting into a world where you can play some more interesting cards that are maybe considered clunky like that. So I think it has to be playable, right? Like a deck that goes 13-2 or better at a Grand Prix, no matter if a computer's playing it or not, I think it has to be somewhat of a playable strategy.
Well, I think Stoneblade traditionally Stoneblade is pretty bad against Miracles, right? And this deck seems like it would have a much better Miracles matchup than other Stoneblade lists. And like Cavern of Souls and Caracas seem like they would really help that with the clicks and Vencers. So like you were saying, like Legends Miracles is really good in the mirror. I imagine that I thought Stoneforge Mystic was reasonably well positioned before I saw the amount of Grixis control. And this deck was probably the best Stoneforge Mystic shell on the weekend.
Yeah, that makes sense. Stoneforge Mystic package is great against random stuff, and you play against a lot of random stuff at a GP. And he sort of added in cards that are good against what a lot of the good players are playing. So he gets a little bit of both. Now you do have to, you know, dodge hyper efficiency, I feel like, with this kind of deck, which can be the problem with it. But yeah, definitely really interesting.
So now there are 2 topics that I want to move into. Wilson, you brought up one interesting point, and that is, you know, that Joe's deck is very good against Sneak and Show with, you know, Vencers and Vendilion clicks and stuff like that. But combo as a whole, and this is probably with Cyrus, more of your department, combo of the whole didn't really show up in the form of Sneak and Show or like Black-Red Reanimator, but I think the underdog of the tournament, something that nobody was really talking about going into this GP, was definitely Storm, and I think Storm definitely did represent, you know, just like five copies placing in the top 40 or something like that. You know, Cyrus, you're a Storm master, I would say at this point. What are some of the reasons why you think this deck did so well, and you know, just what is it going to be like moving forward in terms of how people are going to adapt to combo's presence in the format?
So I think that Griselbrand decks are not positioned very well, as you alluded to. I think the problem with Griselbrand decks is I think that they're really terrible against Grixis Shadow or Blue-Black Shadow, Rug Delver, and Grixis Control and Grixis Delver. So, and I also think both the Griselbrand decks are very weak to Storm. So I think that those decks just have such a hard time with like discard, snap surgical, or like snap counterspell, things like that, that they weren't very well positioned, especially Sneak and Show being awful against Hymn to Turok, and there being a lot of Hymn to Turoks on the weekend. I felt like Storm was pretty well positioned. Since the banning, I've had above an 80% win rate with it in paper over 50 matches. Less so online, but I generally feel people are more prepared for it online because more people play it on there. I just think the main problem with Storm, and this will always be the problem, is that there's not very many people in the world that can consistently do well and invent with it. And I've talked to Bob about this before, where it's like, are you really going to play sideboard cards when there's going to be maybe 5 or 10 people at the tournament who are going to play this deck? So you see in people's sideboards a lot of things like Containment Priests, but not a lot of other sort of randomness. Yeah. And so it's the kind of thing where I felt like a lot of my opponents didn't really quite understand the matchup or what was going on, and also did not have their list prepared to play against Storm. And all my matchups felt pretty good. And other Storm players I know, Ant specifically, I think is very well positioned, and all the Ant players I know that brought the deck did well.
Okay, I mean that's interesting. That kind of reminds me of like the Dredge symptom or whatever, where it's like when Dredge doesn't get played or, you know, doesn't do well for a long time, suddenly you'll see one copy in the top 8. You think it's something like that? Like if people start paying more attention to Storm, that, you know, maybe it'll be harder to compete with that deck?
So I think that what is unique about Storm compared to the other combo decks is I don't really feel like there are effective cards that the blue decks can play to necessarily hate out a Storm deck. There's obviously powerful cards like Hymn to Turok, Counterbalance, Ethersworn Canonist, but they're not just nails in the coffin like they are against some of the other combo decks where you're not realistically winning through them. So I think what really hates Storm out of a metagame is specifically the deck Eldrazi, which there were 2 copies of in the top 16, but I saw no other Eldrazi all weekend. And I played against only 2 Chalice decks over the course of the weekend, which is basically a number of Chalice decks I can expect to play against and I think still do reasonably well at a tournament. And I was lucky enough to just have my draws line up against them. So I think that with all this fair blue, I imagine Eldrazi is going to come back even bigger, though. And then I think Storm will not be well positioned because that's probably the most lopsided matchup in Legacy, like as much as, you know, Death and Taxes versus Elves. Like I think that matchup is realistically 20-80 for Storm if both players are competent. So yeah, I think the reason that Storm did well is there was a lot of fair blue and also just a lot of nonsense decks. Like Storm does crush decks like Elves and Nick Fit, things like that. I saw a lot of that over the weekend.
Hey, what's the rating of Julian's stream? Like, is it rated G, R rated, you know? Because Cyrus just dropped that big E word several times, and I was getting a little bit nervous over there.
What, Eldrazi?
Oh, geez, there it is again. so yeah, we saw that deck do pretty well over the weekend. I just want to mention something about Cyrus. I've been watching Cyrus play a lot of Storm, and I think he gets a serious advantage in paper from his nice guy personality that lulls his opponent into a false sense of security, and then he just lays the hammer on them.
I talk a lot when I play, an unreal amount.
And you're very
really
friendly.
People.
Yeah, you're a very nice guy. You're like the nicest guy that I've ever seen playing Magic. And your paper win percentage has been like 15% better than Magic Online in the past 2 months. And I think the sample size is getting to the point where we have to look at some serious reasons for that. It's pretty sweet. I witnessed Cyrus go 12-0 across 4 side events. It was a GP Sacramento, I think.
Yeah, and I took second in the Channel Fireball 2K last weekend, or the weekend before the GP. Yeah, the deck has been performing very well for me. I also think my list is great, and basically no one else is playing my list, but I think it's way better than other people's lists.
All right, well, you heard it here first. I want to talk about one more thing then, and that is just moving into like the whole blue versus non-blue territory. And I know Bob's been tracking this just like forever, just like the amount of brainstorm saturation in the format. Bob, tell me a little bit more about this and like why you chose the deck you played this weekend.
So historically, the metagame has been about 70% brainstorm in terms of like top finishes. And that's just like a very general term, like, you know, over the last, say, 5 years. During the Treasure Cruise dig-through times, it was at like 80%. So, you know, that's clearly unhealthy. It was reflected in the brainstorm numbers. But going into this GP, brainstorm actually was at the lowest it had ever been, mostly due to the rise of Chalice decks like Eldrazi, Steel Stompy, Moon Prison, as well as Death and Taxes and Lands, and Turbo Depths, and Blackbird Reanimator. There were so many viable non-blue, non-brainstorm options out there. So I was going into this GP thinking like, hey, maybe we don't have to play brainstorm anymore. And the way I also think about it is it's almost like a dichotomy, because before, when Deathrite was legal, the blue decks got both the acceleration and the consistency. Now, I think most of other than Storm, which gets to play Dark Ritual, most of the acceleration, which is like fundamentally what's broken in Magic, is in the non-blue decks, is in the form of Ancient Tomb, you know, Dark Ritual, Mox Diamond, Ether Vial. Like, these cards are absurdly powerful, but don't really fit well with blue decks. So I was like, hey, maybe Legacy is super wide open, and you can kind of pick between these fast mana or mana cheating strategies versus Brainstorm. And it turns out that the top 20 of the GP at least, which was everybody who went 12-3 and better, a full 17 of them were on Brainstorm, and this, which is 85%, which is, you know, super duper high. I do discount it somewhat because this was one of the smallest GPs. I think it was the smallest GP, Legacy GP since GP Denver back in 2013. So I don't think this is necessarily the be-all and end-all, but I will say that I think in Eternal Week in Japan, which had over 600 players, it was a similar story where Brainstorm kind of dominated all these other strategies that seemed to be flourishing with the ban of Deathrite Shaman, but then we saw these larger events and it was like, oh, maybe Brainstorm is still the best for a 15-round event. So I thought that was curious. I don't know, do you guys have a different take on that?
I think the Pro Tour was so the Pro Tour was the tournament that really made me feel like you didn't need to be playing Brainstorm and Legacy. Like my friend won the tournament with Death and Taxes. Pros were playing Eldrazi, pros were playing Black Red Reanimator. But I think that having two very good, consistent players at each side of you is able to make up for the inconsistencies of the non-blue decks. And I still feel like over 15 rounds, it's just a mistake to not play a blue deck. So you look at like Eric Landon online crushing the Black Red Reanimator, but those results don't necessarily transfer over to 15 rounds. And I think this tournament reflected that because I felt like Deathrite was a card that gave consistency to some of the non-blue decks just by being so powerful, and also in a way gave consistency to some of the non-blue decks that didn't play it because it gave the format something else to center around, where now the format is again centered around just Brainstorm. So I thought that Maverick and Loam, neither of the Reliquary decks, would be really well positioned this weekend, and they really just did not show up.
Yeah, I mean, I will say, like, you know, as I mentioned, small sample size, I was playing a potential win-in with 4-color Loam, and I saw a Goblins player also playing a potential win-in. So, you know, if things fell a little bit differently, we could have been talking about Goblins and 4-color Loam in the top 8, which would have been sweet. So, I mean, I still think Brainstorm is probably where you want to be at. So personally, I chose 4-color Loam because it was a deck I had practiced, and I didn't feel like Grixis Delver was necessarily that well positioned. Grixis Delver is kind of like the Jund of the format, where it's going to be like 48 to 52% against everything. And I was looking for a little bit more of an edge, so that's why I played 4-color Loam. I think it's favored against Miracles and Shadow and Death and Taxes, and those were kind of the top 3 decks I expected. It's also favored against Grixis Control, so those are the top 4 decks I expected, so that's why I played Loam. And I did end up playing against those decks. I never played against Death and Taxes, which I think was one of the most hyped decks, but was just hated out by the overabundance of Miracles and Grixis Control.
And Dread of Knights.
Yeah, and Dread of Knights, exactly. Like
I played 2. There's so many Dread Knights this weekend.
Decks in Legacy like have access to really, really powerful sideboard cards. So that's why I think in general, like if there ever is a tier 0 deck, it tends to be like a fair Brainstorm deck, as opposed to like a combo deck or Death and Taxes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Wilson, what are your thoughts?
That's a very general question.
Oh yeah, just how do you feel about Brainstorm having such a dominating presence in the format? I mean, I remember you telling me specifically, like before and after the Pro Tour, that you were very seriously considering not taking a Brainstorm deck to both of the events. You ended up playing Grixis in both times. Do you think it's viable to just not play Brainstorm in these sort of events and see like consistent success?
Yeah, I have complicated thoughts on that. So I do think that part of seeing this many Brainstorm decks do well is the fact that it's a small Grand Prix. I played Grixis Control and did not do well with it at all. I scrubbed out of the event, but I also didn't put a lot of effort into trying to tweak my list. So to be totally honest, I've been working on my startup, Cardboard.live, which is sponsoring this current conversation and stream, and had limited time to actually work on the list. But I will say that my problem with it is that I felt like I was just sort of fighting a fair man's fight. I felt like I was lining up like the old Revolutionary War times and pulling out my musket and just sort of firing away. And there were these sub-games that sort of felt uncontrolled by both me and my opponent. And, whether it was a bunch of Liliana of the Last Hopes, way more than I was used to before, or just things of that nature. So, I mean, I lost to Dredge with 3 surgicals in my sideboard. I felt like there was nothing I can do about that there. And part of that is when I register a deck of these hyper fair cards and play mirrors or these strange unfair strategies, that's just sort of what happens. So I think there's a big opportunity to actually attack this metagame because nothing seems that impressive to me other than some of these Miracles and Stoneblade innovations and Storm. I think Storm seems extremely good, but a lot of these like smattering of fair Grixis Control and Death Shadow cards, it's just not particularly exciting. So I think that you can definitely still do well with a deck that is not Brainstorm, and I wouldn't draw any conclusions about Blue just taking over Legacy again from the results of this event.
Yeah, I'm with Wilson. And if you kind of look at the best performing Legacy players in terms of their GP win rates, like Thomasine and Volson's at the top, and all he ever plays is Death and Taxes for the most part. So I don't think you can really argue that like Death and Taxes is an inconsistent deck, but you can argue that it can be hated out, for example. So it's kind of just like you need to kind of pick your spot in the metagame, and kind of exploit a hole. Like, this weekend potentially like Lands was fairly well positioned. In a lot of ways, not in some ways, yeah, some ways not. But it was a deck that made the top 8, and so I think there will always be some sort of hole in the metagame that doesn't include Brainstorm necessarily that you'll be able to exploit.
I think one of the largest or most significant impacts on the metagame now is Kolagun's command being just such a prevalent card in Legacy. So whereas before you could really rely on riding your broken turn 1 Ether Vial or Chalice to free wins, now essentially the most played control/mid-range strategy runs quite a few reactive answers to those cards, which is a really big deal. So now that Grixis Control has really cemented itself, I mean, it really did this at the Pro Tour, but hadn't really done this yet at the beginning of the new meta. And now, that it really is so mainstream, I think people need to figure out sort of different way of fighting this deck. And part of the reason that Grixis Control has done well is because it does kill those artifact non-blue strategies. But as we see Ant doing so well here, there are some other unfair strategies that then turn around and I think attack Grixis Control. So it's definitely interesting. I'd like to see maybe some Maverick or things like that be tested. I think that's maybe a type of strategy that has some potential.
I have a good list for you, a Maverick list, Wilson.
He actually doesn't, but it was.
What do you think, Anuraag?
I don't know. So those are really good points. Just on a side note, I know Julian's been tweaking around with Maverick, and he says that it's very just an underrated deck in general. I agree with that. I just want to change topics though real quick and look at like other innovations maybe in some of the deck lists. And I don't know how much content I have to fill this topic, but we're just looking at some of the notes that I had, and I see like, for example, in the Lands deck, did you know that Sam Black was playing 4 Faithless Looting in his list? In his Lands deck?
Yeah, Jarvis talked to me a lot about it. He said it was terrible. So.
Oh, okay.
But Jarvis played 2 this weekend and did fairly well. He had 2 draws that sounded like there was kind of out of his control. And Sam Black obviously did fine as well. I think that, those 2 are the 2 people playing Faithless Looting, I think.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Jarvis said that he thought he played too many Faithless Lootings, and he would have maybe done something different. But it is really
them out every single game.
Okay.
Oh wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. I've just never seen that tech before. And then I guess like if we look at other cards or pillars of the format, so like in the Miracles deck, one thing that I'm very fascinated with is the card that you mentioned before, Wilson, Accumulated Knowledge. I think the banning of Deathrite strictly has some sort of impression on why this card actually saw any play at all this past weekend. And then another card that I think that just like completely overperformed was Back to Basics. I'd be very surprised if that card just doesn't go up in price more, or we see a lot more deck lists picking that card up in general.
Yeah, I think the new Miracles really relies heavily on Back to Basics as a core part of its strategy. So whereas before I think that this non-basic hate was seen as more of a peripheral, let's attack this axis of the meta, I think now it really is in some ways a back to basics deck that really uses that to beat half the format. And, to me, it just seems like almost as important as a Jace the Mind, the Sculptor in the list. But that's actually a big reason why I think Miracles is a lot better now, is when the deck is built around this back to basics package. For me, I think Accumulated Knowledge is really interesting. I mean, I tried it for the first time and was really impressed. Really excited about playing Accumulated Knowledge mirror matches because that gets crazy when it checks your
People
opponent's
are not ready for that.
Yeah.
We're gonna go from AK to Think Twice because that's the tech to win the AK mirror matches because they board out their AKs and then you have Think Twices.
Oh god, I was playing against Topher in the Grand Prix, right? And literally the game in my mind was just gonna be like Drago. All right, cleanup step, discard my Accumulated Knowledge. You're gonna cast yours? I bet you won't. Like that kind of thing. So yeah, I don't know. We'll see. We'll see how it goes. I want to talk about one more thing. Did you guys happen to watch any of the coverage this weekend?
I watched someone slow play around 15.
Yikes. Okay.
Just kidding.
So WotC did this really interesting thing where they basically followed Reed all weekend long, and I think it got some really good support. I mean, I didn't get to watch a lot of coverage. I watched a little bit of day one coverage, like as I was falling asleep, so I just get the commentators to lull me to sleep. But the idea seems super interesting, and I want to know if you guys just have any input or commentary on that. What you would like to see done differently. I mean, obviously, since not all of us were playing in the event, we didn't get to watch the whole thing front to end.
Well, what I absolutely love about watching a game like Magic is watching the story. So you have characters in the story, which are the players. You have all of these different interesting points of ups and downs, and by the end of it, you get to see somebody come out the winner or the hero. You have villains in it. So it's really cool to be able to follow somebody throughout, and it really adds to the story narrative of the event. I think one of the biggest problems of actually following a tournament in Paper Magic is you get lost to things like that. So I think it really draws people in. I'd be interested to see their stats as far as minutes per viewer. I wouldn't be surprised if it went up. I was at the event, so I wasn't stuck to watching coverage, but I think if I were at home, I'd be probably more interested in actually sticking in there, and particularly if the hero is doing well, I think I'd be interested to see how they end up.
I think that one of the biggest problems with Magic is it's a very terrible game to watch from a coverage perspective, and that's one thing I really like about what Wilson is doing with Cardboard.live. And I think that I've talked a lot about this, how I feel like Magic needs heroes and Magic needs villains, and there is no better hero than Reed Duke. Everyone loves Reed Duke. On coverage all weekend, he was very polite. He played very well. He tends to play interesting decks and treat his opponent and the judges with respect. And he's also a great commentator, which helps when he's doing like the time walk matches. And I think that that's something that Star City Games has done very well, is to make their players popular and to sell an image that WotC has kind of struggled with for like Grand Prix coverage. And I think that this was an interesting experiment that I know I thought would be terrible and a lot of people thought would not work out. But the response I heard for it was overwhelmingly positive. And from what I watched of it, I also really enjoyed it.
I think Anuraag is coming from an interesting perspective because he actually got to play the villain in one of these matches against Reed Duke on camera. And, you've gotten so much, I don't want to use the hate as an extreme word, but
backlash.
Yeah. I think it really, but from my perspective, it really came out that the Twitch community was so in the court of their hero, Reed Duke, by the end of that tournament. Maybe you can describe what that was like, and if it was cool with you, or if maybe that was not a very pleasant experience to be the villain in round 15.
This is an interesting perspective because, okay, so here's my background, right? I don't really watch Magic coverage. I only follow Legacy. I only play one deck. And so, just going into this last round or whatever, my eyes were on the top 8. I had no idea what was going on in terms of Pro Player of the Year or anything like that. And so I know there was a lot of drama about me slow playing and not conceding at the end of the round for Player of the Year points and stuff like that. And for me as just a regular person who's just I'm not a personality or anything like that, right? Being paired up against Reed in the final round as quote the villain it's kind of an uncomfortable position to be in because it's no matter what I do. I feel there's always going to be something that you could say about what I could have done better, and I'm not trying to excuse some of the things I did, right? So I definitely mechanically played a little bit slowly here and there, maybe took a couple extra seconds on some of the decisions, but it's just a little bit I was very nervous going into the last round, and I feel if I was put in this position again, I would try to find a way to do decline just because of the pressure of that's not something I want to necessarily be the victim of. Is that the right word? I don't know. I don't. But I love the experiment, and I love just how we got to delve deeper into Reed's mind, because I know I've said this to people before. When I watch pro players play, I always want to know what's going on in their heads. How are they mapping out games and stuff like that. So I mean, there are going to be pros because the hand cams were very very interesting, by the way. Just seeing Reed's draws and stuff like that every turn. But yeah, I don't know. So I think as a draft of what we could expect to see in the future, I think this experiment went very well. A lot of things to consider going into this. Maybe next time we could get a second player in as well, or something like that.
Yeah, I want to stick up for you a little bit because being your friend and seeing that situation, I was a little bit frustrated by the community thinking that Anuraag should have maybe conceded to Reed. I think that's totally ridiculous. And Reed Duke, I don't think would have ever expected that. I think that he verbalized to you that he did not expect you to concede. I mean, people are fighting and they're running these races, they're fighting these fights because they're trying to earn them. They're trying to earn the Player of the Year trophy. They're trying to win events. And I don't know why sometimes as Magic players at these tournaments, we get in these positions where, the guys that have a lot of points and maybe something on the line sort of start to expect a concession. It's just not really how the game works. So I don't think Reed expected it, but I'm a little bit disappointed that a large number of Twitch viewers, which of course Twitch viewers are Twitch viewers, but seem to expect a concession there. I think that's sort of crazy. So particularly from an entertainment perspective, like I would think also that it's round 15 and you get to watch a potentially very high stakes match. And I think that's a very cool opportunity for coverage. So,
did you win game 2 Anuraag after he ulted Liliana?
Yeah, it was insane. I've beaten Liliana emblems before, but never with the Monastery Mentor. So I had to have like exactly 4 cards out of 20, 30 or whatever, how many cards were left in my deck, and I found them all. And
so that was the biggest complaint I saw, was that you didn't concede to Liliana, the Last Hope emblem on Twitch coverage. And then you proceeded to win the game. So I found that very frustrating that people were saying you were slow playing while down a game in a control mirror, which isn't how slow playing works if you have any idea of how the strategy of Magic or why someone would cheat would work. But people were complaining that you were slow playing, and then you went on to win the game, so you had outs and you played to them. And also, I think that a lot of people that don't play Legacy think that when you're cantripping, it means you're not advancing the game or the board state. And I play 0 creatures ever, right? And so people a lot of times will think, oh, well, you're slow playing when you're casting Brainstorm or Ponder and taking a very reasonable amount of time. And I think that was kind of the vibe I was getting from Twitch was, 1, they were very excited about Reed and wanted him to win because he had been following him all weekend. But 2, I think a lot of people just didn't. I think a lot of Legacy players were at the tournament also, and it just felt to me like people didn't understand quite what the situation was. And I found it frustrating. I went back and watched it on the trip home because I had heard people talking about it, and I thought you played at a reasonable place.
Plus, the Twitch community doesn't know how lovable you are in person, Anuraag.
You're so nice and handsome.
Oh my gosh.
I will say one thing, though.
Bob disagrees.
Bob is my biggest fan.
Well, so after seeing Mentor in that situation, I am shocked that to this day you continue to play the measly, tiny number of Mentors that you play in your Miracles lists. I'm hoping that maybe this changes in the future.
Well, look,
it's not as bad as. It's not as bad as top 8ing a Legacy GP with no Jace the Mind Sculptor in your Miracles deck. That would just be stupid.
Shots fired. So, yeah, just to add one more point, I had also even overheard Owen Turtenwald, Reed's good friend. I'm not sure if he was talking about this situation or a different one, but he said that 100% he would not expect anybody who's live for top 8 to concede to Reed for any reason. Even potentially if Reed were, super far ahead, as long as you're still live for top 8, that's your dream, that's your goal. You want to make the top 8. That's why you showed up. So there should just be kind of no expectations of a concession in any kind of situation where you're still, playing for something. So even Owen was kind of on board.
Okay, well, I mean, that's cool but that still sets the bar a little bit. I mean, even if you're just live for 9th place, I mean, you went to this event, you battled for 14 rounds, and on your 15th round, the difference between finishing, 40th and 9th or 10th is still significant in your experience of how you feel about how you did at the tournament. And, I think as far as the game goes, this is always the way that I felt about this, is that the pro community in general is great and whatever, but there's sometimes this expectation of concessions to feed them points, and I just don't really think that's great for the game.
I think that concessions, intentional draws, so concessions and intentional draws and splitting are some of the biggest problems with Magic as a spectator sport, because they don't lead to interesting games. And I know that there's 2 people in this Skype call that split the finals of an event, and I thought that the game was less interesting because they were friends and there was nothing on the line at that Eternal Extravaganza. But I remember watching that and just being before I knew either of you, And I was just like, well, this feels kind of lame. Like, it was obvious you guys had split and were friends and were talking. But it's just, I hate that it's arbitrary who, like, to concede to someone like Wilson was saying. Like, I think that if Magic wants to grow as a sport that's interesting to watch, you can't have people just scooping to people at the end of a really interesting match. That doesn't make any sense. And it's not interesting if you're a fan. And the same with if you're rooting for someone all weekend and then they don't top 8 because someone conceded to someone and someone conceded to someone else and then 2 people drew. And it's like, oh, well, also the person I was rooting for all weekend got 9th on breakers. And that happened this tournament. Someone got 9th by like a very fractional percentage. And I don't know the whole situation, but that there was probably draws into top. There was IDs in the top 8. I think things like that are frustrating as a fan of Magic. And it just makes it less interesting. And if people want to do that, I'm never upset at them, but it should also never be expected, I think.
Yep, that's a good point. All right, there's one last topic that I want to talk about, and that, is there was another new deck that I completely forgot to talk about earlier, and I'm going to call it lovingly Sperling Blade, or I don't know, Blue-White Delver Blade. This is what Owen took to a 10th place finish, and this will be our last topic before we close, but I just want to, what do you guys think about this? Owen posted this list like the Friday or the Thursday, like a couple days before the event, and was just like, here's my list if you want to win, play it. And I mean, he delivered. Bob, do you have any thoughts on this deck list?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't seem to be doing anything particularly powerful. Like, you're playing Delver along with Snapcaster, Back to Basics, and Jason the Mind Sculptor. Like, those are all good cards. They don't necessarily synergize together. Like, Delver and Plow, I think, makes sense if you're trying to attack a very narrow metagame. And I can see it being, favored against something like Death Shadow. But overall, like, over the long course of a tournament, like, you are going to play against other random decks that these, like, little things are going to add up and cost you. So it's kind of just like, I think of that deck more of as Blue-White Stoneblade, and then you're splashing Delver and Daze, kind of. And honestly, Delver and Daze are good, but they're not necessarily, like, the best things you want to be doing in the format right now. So I don't know, to me it seems like there are more options out there. My personal favorite Stoneblade deck right now is probably Esper Blade. If they can kind of get the mana base to work out and beat Delver, then I think it's actually pretty well positioned.
Cool. Any other thoughts on the deck?
I think that 24 instants and sorceries doesn't feel like quite enough to me to play in a Delver deck. I also think that the main question you're asking yourself when you play this list is, if you look at it as a Delver deck rather than a Stoneblade deck, which I think it makes sense to look at it as a Stoneblade deck, is the question of, is playing 4 basics worth more to me than playing Lightning Bolt and Pyroblast? And I think that depends a lot on the meta. So, like, in this meta, I think that I would have liked to be playing Lightning Bolt and Pyroblast with all the Jace the Mind Sculptors this deck's fine against Back to Basics. But the things like that, all the Delvers, Snapcaster Mages, but in a meta that has a lot of Death and Taxes and Eldrazi and Blood Moon Stompy, I would much rather be playing the 4 basics than Lightning Bolts and Pyroblast. So I think it's interesting because this is very similar to the deck that Owen won a GP with, but he cut the red for a better mana base. So it's always interesting to ask yourself, and the same with Andrew Cuneo, he was playing 0 red cards, right? So
yeah,
I think that was almost a concession to how popular Death and Taxes was at the Pro Tour and how well it did, was that you'd want to have a slightly better mana base, I imagine. But then again, if a meta has 17 fair blue decks out of 22 possible decks, and also 2 combo decks that are weak to Pyroblast and Storm, Seek and Show 2, if that was there, then you probably want to be on red cards. So it feels weird to me to not play Pyroblast, but it's an interesting decision.
And I hate to pile on here, but I essentially agree with everything that Bob said. I think that a lot of these cards match up specifically against certain things in a certain meta, but in general, the anti-synergies are a little bit much sometimes. And when I look at this list, I think that this is my least favorite list out of all of the decks that did well. And people could say, oh, but Owen, got 10th. But we have to look at, too, there were a lot of pros with 3 buys that played this deck. So I think if we actually look at the number of very good players who had 3 buys playing this deck and see that the overall performance, I don't know the numbers, so I don't want to be making stuff up, but I would guess that we'd be a little bit disappointed in the list, even though we see it sitting here at 10th place.
Very interesting. Okay, cool. Well, it's an interesting way to leave the show, but I think we've taken up a lot of time, and I know Bob needs to go to sleep. So I'm going to call it here. Guys, thank you very much for joining me. If you have any plugs for any, Bob, I know your Twitch is /Gristlepuff. Cyrus, you're working on a new podcast now, right?
Yeah, I have a podcast, Top Down Legacy, with my co-host Eric Virgo, who's an excellent Magic player, Legacy player. And I also do stream at twitch.tv/CyrusCG. Okay,
cool. Ed Wilson, everybody knows now, but what is that you are the CEO and founder of?
Cardboard.live.
Cardboard.live. All right, cool. Thanks, guys, for joining us, and we're going to call it here today. See you for the rest of the games coming up soon.
Goodbye, friends.
Goodbye, friends.
Nice.